legalisefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalisefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalisefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Paul Sutton. Many current social, cultural, political and economic trends are deeply disturbing, all the more so because so many people are unaware of or simply ignore them. Gathering pace in the 21st century, both 9/11 and the pandemic were key temporal markers in the acceleration of these trends. A further sinister undercurrent lies in where they overlap, and the fact that they are serving an overarching agenda that is profoundly anti-freedom, anti-human, and even anti-life. One of the most obvious manifestations is the unelected so-called elites and tech gurus blithely preaching do as we say, not as we do, while pushing transhumanism and fanatical technocratic dictatorship on fearful populations. We analyse our present predicament with particular reference to parallels in dystopian science fiction.
You have asked, are we happy? Are we happy and effective? Consultation with leading experts in the field makes it perfectly clear that we are all now programmed for perfect happiness, perfect happiness, perfect happiness, perfect happiness. There are, of course, occasional technical or electronic errors in programming and or surveillance which produce perverse exceptions. First, they start skipping prescribed drug dosages. Then they begin touching, then indulging in various sexual acts, and the ultimate perversion, love. For such extreme psychobiological misfunction, only isolation will do.
You know how a game serves us. Nations are bankrupt, gone. None of that tribal warfare anymore. Even the corporate wars are a thing of the past. So now we have the majors and their executives. Transport, food, communication, housing, luxury, energy, a few of us making decisions on a global basis. Now everyone has all the comforts, you know that. No poverty, no sickness, no needs, and many luxuries which you enjoy just as if you were in the executive class. Corporate society takes care of everything. And all it asks of anyone, or has ever asked of anyone ever, is not to interfere with management decisions.
You still don't get it, do you, boys? There ain't no countries anymore. No more good guys. They're running the whole show. They own everything, the whole goddamn planet. They can do whatever they want. What's wrong with having it good for a change? And they're going to let us have it good if we just help them. They're going to leave us alone. Let us make some money. You can have a little taste of that good life, too. Now, I know you want it. Hell, everybody does. What's the threat? We all sell out every day. Might as well be on the winning team.
Hello and welcome, Paul, and thank you so much for joining us again on legalisefreedom.com.
Oh, thanks so much for having me again, Greg. I really enjoyed the previous one, and I'm sure I'll enjoy this just as much.
Excellent. Well, yeah, there's a link to our previous conversation on the website page for this one. Your blog came to my attention, and that inspired our original chat. Just before we get started on this one, which is basically a follow-up to the previous one, just give listeners a little potted bio.
Yeah, sure. Well, I originally studied science at university at Oxford, did a doctorate, a DPhil as it's called here. Worked in industry for a bit. I'd always been very keen on writing, did a lot at university, and worked in industry for a bit, for a long time. And then I'd always wanted to go into teaching, and I went into teaching English because I was doing a lot of writing at the time, having a lot of stuff published, poetry mainly, but of a particularly extreme and satirical sort of hyper-reality, really. And then taught English for a number of years, but recently left because of various issues that have arisen in the kind of woke indoctrination, which I talked about a lot last time. And but since been doing this blog against monolithic diversity, lots of articles on there that kind of, particularly ones on corporate dystopia and the nightmare of managerialism, which I'd always been fascinated with and seen it throughout my time in industry as well.
Yeah, well, I encourage listeners to go back and check out the previous dialogue, but they don't have to. If they can, this can be listened to in isolation. But as mentioned, it's really a continuation today, and we're really talking about social, cultural, and political trends currently, particularly in the West, where they overlap, perhaps in ways that people don't really observe openly. If there's an agenda driving these things, or agendas, perhaps one overarching agenda, that the how and why of what's happening, because so many people are mystified and bamboozled by events around them. They just can't understand it. You know, it's like they're suffering tremendous cognitive dissonance. And we can talk a bit about where this might be headed in future. To get us started, I mean, corporatism and, you know, corporatism versus capitalism, something we'll get into more or less straight away. But you used the term there, managerialism. So perhaps you could just, and this is not as technical as it might sound, but just get us started with saying what your conception of that is, what that is within your writing.
Well, I first became acquainted with the term, like so much else with me, by reading Orwell and reading a review of he'd written on James Burnham's famous book, The Managerial Revolution, which actually was looking at Stalinism and but also looking at the American corporate world. And this is back in the 30s and 40s. And what Burnham was talking about was how a new technocratic elite was arising, who really were not interested in ideology. They'd serve anything, but they were convinced, really, that the world was heading for a post-political future, which is bizarre when he was particularly talking about Stalinism, where the focus was intensely on the political at an individual level. But actually, he could see the motivation for the technocrats, including scientists, was entirely power-driven. Our managerialism has now, slowly but surely, I mean, when I was first in industry in the late 80s, we saw bizarre things people probably don't remember or maybe weren't around for. I don't know if you were, Greg. Total quality management, bizarre concepts taken from Japan, and we were indoctrinated with this stuff that most of us thought was gobbledygook. And then, you know, various other things. If you worked for a big corporation, I worked for Centrica, British Gas, and also Shell. And it was increasingly obvious that, and particularly the people one worked with, they were not really interested in anything other than managing. And it has always been a bizarre aspect of life to me to be told so-and-so was in management. And now, of course, the workplace is completely run by these people. So human resources now took over from personnel, and the power they wield is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. In fact, we have a technocratic government where really politics is an embarrassment to them.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. And I wonder, I mean, look at the increasing irrelevance of political parties in most Western countries, you know, particularly, I would maybe say that parties somehow in the US or the UK, to take best known examples for us, probably are irrelevant, but certainly not fulfilling the roles that they were set out for, and certainly politics not functioning by any shadow of a definition of what it might have done a century ago or even 50 years ago. I'm just wondering if maybe I've always made fun of Francis Fukuyama's End of History book, and I'm wondering if this post-political future, which you could argue that we're, if not already in and moving into, was misread as somehow that if traditional party politics goes away, as you see in so many futuristic dystopias in fiction, that somehow meant the end of history, that history was somehow all about wars and politics. And if the technocrats could just get the reins of power, that would pretty much be it. We'd plain sailing from then on.
It's such a brilliant point. I mean, there's another brilliant essay by Orwell about H.G. Wells, who in many ways is a very admirable figure, an incredible imagination. But Wells had this bizarre idea for an elite run, the world to be run by an elite, and the technocrats and scientists would remove any need for human passions. And this is from an era where, of course, they're seeing the horrors of so much from industrialization. But I think nobody predicted where this would lead to. And the technocratic elite now are terrifying. And what's so terrifying about them, of course, is that they are absolutely convinced that they're sane and we're all mad, and that we're all bigoted, atavistic, and they are calmly rational. We've seen this so often in all the kind of discourse now over COVID, over Brexit, over anything really, that they'll always claim they're evidence-based, they're very dispassionate. And these people are fanatics, actually, if you look at how they wielded power, particularly during COVID. It's, I think, crystallized so much for us, or for many of us, although most of us were talking about a lot of this beforehand. And I think it does date from what you're talking about. And I think Fukuyama, maybe like you, I assumed that it was a load of nonsense. He was talking about the ideal of a liberal elite. But then that's a bizarre thing with Tony Blair and the New World, kind of liberal interventionism and everything. I look back now and realise that I was very naive about a lot of that stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, well, the word liberal, like a lot of terms, has become corrupted in Orwellian fashion to the point where, liberal became to eat out of that particular context. But if you described yourself as liberal in terms perhaps of social attitudes or whatever, that suddenly became turned into like, oh, you're one of these liberal types, as in like anything goes and nothing matters. You see that now, particularly amongst young people. If someone's described as a classic liberal, they might as well somehow be a Nazi. I'm not quite sure how that came about, but these terms evolve over time. Language does. I was talking a moment ago about dystopias in fiction, futuristic fiction, and I think that a lot of ideas in society and culture first manifest in fiction, and then they, for good or ill, then perhaps bleed out into the wider society. A lot of science fiction writers have been very prescient. You're just talking about Orwell, for example. And one of your recent posts, you mentioned J.G. Ballard, one of my favorite science fiction authors. A couple of books of his that I've never read, but I looked up, Supercan and Kingdom Come. And when I was looking at the synopsis for those, I immediately started to think about all of the, things like Davos, where the elites of the world gather to carve out our collective fate, about how these people live versus how they say that we should all live, gated communities. And then I started to think about other fictional concepts like, the film, you've seen the film Elysium, which features the elite living off planet, but it's the same basic concept. It's like, do what we say, not what we do. And also then in Ballard's books, the ones I mentioned, and in many others, a so-called utopia actually being a quite obvious dystopia, but still being spun as a utopia. In 1984, they're told they're living in utopia. In Brave New World, they're living in utopia. Whereas in Supercan, for example, you have, quote, an underworld of crime, deviant sex, and drugs amongst the elite. And hang on a minute, that's not fiction. That's real life.
Well, it's funny. I've just reread, not because of this interview, but I've just reread Supercan. I'm an absolute Ballard fanatic. And he has this very clear transition. Probably ones you've read are the earlier ones like Concrete Island or High Rise, or the ones on the drowned, the sort of global warming. Yeah,
I'm thinking particularly of High Rise, which has got a lot of commonalities, Concrete Island. So they're the ones that bring to mind, the brutalist architecture and future visions as they were in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating. This is what's so amazing about science fiction. I think back to watching Tomorrow's World and things, and Raymond Baxter, and all that, and what Ballard then changed into, really, with the trilogy that I've read the middle one of. Cocaine Nights is the first one, and as you say, quite well summarized, they're all about gated communities. So Cocaine Nights, then the one I've just reread. Well, I've reread them all, Supercan, and then the Millennium People. So Cocaine Nights is set in the south of Spain, in the endless kind of timeshare, boredom but perfection world of kind of the holiday resorts, really, and these extraordinary retirement places where Ballard used to go quite often and drive around. And he's a great one for, that's what I love about Ballard. He found business parks and the retail parks and also these places so much more interesting than the kind of North London gentrification or any of that stuff. And he was so ahead of his time in this. And in that one, in mostly all of these novels, you have a kind of strange Prospero-like figure who's often a psychologist or something who is actually a madman. They're very funny as well. That's the point. So in Cocaine Nights, the community needs waking up, really, because they're all brain dead people just retired there. So they have a kind of sports director, entertainment guy who instigates a crime wave to pet people up, and he breaks into apartments and drags things off. And there's a great line where he says to someone, believe you me, there's nothing that wakes people up more than finding a turd floating in their swimming pool. And I can't go into everything in it. And then the next one, Supercan, is set in the south of France in the business world of a huge business park where another Prospero character, Penrose Wilder, the name Penrose is deliberate after a neuroscientist. And this guy is the kind of central medical figure, but he's noticed that the people are working too hard and they won't take any leisure because they love being part of the managerial elite and everything. And this is a huge business park with companies like Roche and all the pharmaceutical giants there, etc. And so he has people literally forming a sort of bizarre crime gang where they go and mug immigrants in the local areas of Cannes and Nice. And it produces a huge upswing in mental health and physical health. And he regards it as like a kind of an inoculation almost of violence to help with the problem that Ballard identified as we all suffer from, which is boredom. There's an interview with Ballard where he's asked, what do you think the future will be like? And most science fiction writers will be full of stuff about, the technical changes. And he said, well, I don't know, but one thing is the future will be boring. And he said, boredom is taking over and we're fighting endlessly against it, but we're not winning.
Well, that's largely due to the limits of our thinking about what we are, in terms of like bigger sort of cosmological picture. I mean, that's getting into metaphysics we don't really have time for, but the endless materialism has brought us to this place where we are now, never mind in these fictional stories, but where we all find ourselves. I don't think you or I are bored with life, but no. Billions of people are. And that's because we've been told that there is nothing else than what we see on the TV screen, never mind out the window. And this brings us, I suppose, to, again, thinking about fiction and the future. A lot of people in the last few years have talked about, in Orwellian terms about, we're living in 1984. And fewer people have said, we're living in Brave New World. I kind of feel it's kind of an awful kind of synthesis of the two at the minute, really, in terms of trends. We see kind of technological advances continuing in terms of surveillance, control, and medication and data on anything and everything, and things being increasingly virtual and dehumanized, and at the same time increasing kind of griminess and material deprivation and people doing less well materially than they used to, and lifespans even decreasing in so-called advanced nations. So it's a strange kind of farrago of things happening at the minute, really. A closer vision would be, in terms of fiction, you could look at something like Blade Runner as perhaps being, the marriage of these two ideas, advanced technology, but just kind of a lot of a grime at the same time. Some people doing very well, other people just falling into the gutter, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, really. I mean, I wrote this blog about the culture of dystopia, and I think Orwell, he was fantastic at foreseeing things, but he's very political, and his prescience was outstanding, and particularly over language and how that would be used. But in terms of technology, Orwell never worked in industry. He was worked as a military policeman, and then came out to this country and really wrote. He worked in the media a bit, but what he never foresaw, and this is why he was so excited by Burnham, was the rise of corporatism and the extraordinary way that technology. I mean, the technology is hinted at in 1984, but this is where Huxley was he was a scientist, Huxley, and he was better on that. And then the one who's better again on it, I'm not saying a better writer, but just in terms of maybe the ideas that they came up with, is you've mentioned Philip K. Dick with Blade Runner, but a number of the others really as well. I've heard a number of your interviews where you talk about the red pill and the blue pill, all that. The Matrix, all those ideas kind of come from Philip K. Dick. And this, I think, technology is always very difficult for all of us to understand how it's driven everything. Political change actually often follows technology. And I think that's one of the things. So politics has a limit. And you know, you're right there where you say, well, are we really living in the Orwellian world? A lot of it is just technology driven. I say just. That is the problem. And now people are starting to say, I know that there's worries that AI will take over and that we'll lose all of humanity.
Yes, Orwell, I suppose, and even Huxley saying technology as a tool of coercion and control, being exploited by elites or shadowy figures, whatever. Whereas the emerging situation at the minute is more who's really in control. Technology is influencing those who are creating technology, which influences the technology they create, and so it goes. And then you begin to wonder about, who's driving? Is anybody driving? And it becomes the technology. I suppose. I think we've seen, in our lifetimes, the exponential growth in, say, for example, at simple terms, computing power, but how that has then fed out into everything else. I mean, I read lots of futuristic fiction when I was a teenager in the 80s and continued to read it throughout my life. But time and time again, with few exceptions, the reality has tended to outstrip the fictional element. The one exception being space travel. That's actually turned out to be the reverse, the inverse, but that's just completely stalled. So it seems we're going nowhere on that front. But in terms of technological advances, within the sort of 24/7 technological matrix that we're all immersed in, well, that's gone faster than anyone could have imagined.
It is. It's really interesting you mentioned all that. And I'm thinking of another writer who's really influenced me, which is completely different. And he read 1984 when Orwell was on his deathbed, and he was very excited by it. And you don't want to make this link, but it's true. Evelyn Waugh, the great English satirical writer, and he visited Orwell when he was dying at UCH of TB. And he recognised, because he was a brilliant writer and a genius, really, how prophetic 1984 was. But he made a point, and he said, I don't believe religion could disappear in the way that you have it disappearing. And what fascinates me, a different strand to our discussion, is how actually, with all this technology, in some ways, we're regressing to a more atavistic and a more quasi-religious kind of mindset as well. So the technocratic and managerial elite, their vision of how human nature would just slot into this seems to be completely not working. And this is something Ballard's very strong on. This is why he has such violence mixed in with the technology. Of course, his famous book Crash, about a group of weirdos who are obsessed with car crashes and see great physical and sexual attraction in it. So I think we also, in weird ways, are regressing back to a kind of mythological, and I was very taken with your talk the other day about this sort of thing. There's a strange, bizarre juxtaposition of the two going on.
Well, I think in Brave New World we saw, the attempt to placate the population with pleasures, or not so much punishments as in 1984, but drugs and freedom from physical discomfort and all the rest of it. But then, that they might reach a certain point where certain human beings do zone out. I think we can see that, that can be done with not only physical but psychological means. But a lot of humans do, crave something visceral and even atavistic, as you say. And many of the dystopian futuristic visions in fiction involve just that sort of rebellion, something within the human, something primordial, and you see that you mentioned violence, and that's quite often you see that in people who do extreme sports and things, or people who perhaps do hard drugs, that they're looking for something transcendent, and sometimes if they can't find that within themselves, this external stimulus, even if it is violence, sadomasochism could be something like that. And, anything at all, committing crime, so it can be something legal or illegal, but that's a movable feast depending on what era you live in. In Ballard's High Rise, we see that as this community living in this enormous, what it says on the tin, high rise apartment development, with the best of everything. But you see the hierarchy of society mirrored in the floors of the building, but how that descends increasingly into, towards the end, actually unimaginable depravity. And violence in a society that, on the face of it, this corporate society that is, in which the needs of everyone are provided for by no longer by the state, of course, but by the corporation. Again, this is a post-political idea, isn't it? That after political systems have atrophied and fallen away and ceased to be useful to whoever, it's replaced by the corporate state. A really good example of this is Rollerball. The movie, which was based on a short story. One of the leaders of one of the big corporate entities says at one point to one of the protagonists, there are no wars anymore, no countries, and everyone is, needs are provided for. There's no hunger, no illness, blah, blah, blah. But even then, the whole premise of the film is that they have this game, Rollerball, this extreme violence, and it's bread and circuses, really, Roman Empire style,
Well, the one I'm thinking of that my daughter was really tired of, I read the books, the Hunger Games, of course. If you think about the Hunger Games, why was that so popular? That feeds the whole premise of the Hunger Games, is that you've got this society, but of course they worship violence in this ritualistic way. And I think one of the points about, and this is something Evelyn Waugh, effectively, who is now the least politically correct of writers, but he really was always aware that civilization is paper thin. And he basically was not a progressive, to say the least. He'd be described as a reactionary, but his view was, it's a full-time job keeping the peace. That's all that government can do. Forget all the other stuff, utopianism. He was the ultimate anti-utopian. But in many ways, he understood a lot from that. And one of his great novels, probably his greatest, A Handful of Dust, the line taken from T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland, has an incredible modern power to it. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it ends in a nightmare, a dystopian nightmare, actually, of a man reading endlessly Dickens to a semi-savage in the South American jungle where he's gone as an explorer. And I think one of the powers of religion, and I'm an atheist, is it, especially Christianity, it always has accepted the dark side of human nature. And that's the whole point of it, obviously, with salvation and that. One of the problems with the technocratic elite is, where is that in their worldview? That's why they always need us, people who are cast out, people who are literally, they're not rational, because all religions, and theirs is one, they need the devil. And so the devil for them is the people who aren't accepting their cold, rational view of everything.
Well, I mean, one of the current strands of Salvationism, I suppose, in a post-religious world, it doesn't mean that the tendency isn't religious, but it's seen as outside man-made spiritual systems, is that the whole alien thing, off-world salvationism, will be saved from ourselves by some other entities from elsewhere. That's very similar to it's religious when you break it down. And that's separate from the idea of the existence of any other type of life, in the cosmos.
Yeah.
That's a sort of like, that's an interesting scientific question. But in terms of, the constant ideas of government disclosure and, where Earth is, we're being watched over by, benevolent extraterrestrials, which will not allow us to destroy ourselves and all of that. It's just projecting outward all the time. Our salvation lies elsewhere rather than within ourselves.
Yeah, and another writer that I think is very worth discussing. I don't know if you've read much by Theodore D Rilling.
I think I've got a book of his collected articles.
Yeah.
Did he publish Our Culture, What's Left of It?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the one I've got, yeah.
Well, he's got a brilliant essay on Ballard, very good essays on, and he's particularly good on dystopias and why the 20th century was so rich in dystopias. And you know, he came up with a quote which I think is so powerful, where dreams are blueprints, nightmares are the result. And he'd be regarded as a reactionary figure, but he worked for years. It's a pseudonym, Theodore D Rilling. His real name is Anthony Daniels, something like that. He's a doctor by training, and he worked as a psychiatrist as well. But he's by no means enamoured that much of the psychiatry profession, and nor is Ballard for that matter either. And he was a doctor, or at least started reading medicine at Cambridge. And Dalrymple worked as a prison doctor in the prison, not full time, but he was a consultant, but he did a lot of work in prisons. And his essays on the kind of nightmare of the actual underclass that we have in Britain and throughout the world actually are so worth reading. And he is particularly acute on the awful mismatch with utopian thinking. And now, if he was in the health service, goodness, I mean, he wouldn't survive, I'm sure, with the kind of the bizarre juxtaposition of these idealistic things with things falling apart.
Yeah, well, that tension between dystopia and utopia, the former being, the latter being promoted and advertised as former, we see that in, again, something I think that's breaking down now, has been for a while, the promised consumerist future, materialist future, materialism in terms of lifestyle now, promised increasingly for, around the world. Is all really taking off, I suppose, after the Second World War. In the US, boom time in the 50s, and that gradually filtered out into the West predominantly, but other countries, de facto Western countries, parts of Australasia and on and on. And with that beginning to go away, we have this kind of replacement coming in, as I mentioned actually in the last interview with Kingsley Dennis.
Yeah.
This idea now that we're going to be doing materially less well, but actually that is going to be spun as a source of happiness as well. So you'll get your blenders and your fridge freezers and all the rest of it, however it would have been spun in the 1950s. That'll make you happy. But now, actually, the machinery and the resources to deliver those is becoming tricky. So we're going to spin the lack of those things as a positive.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to get back. I totally agree with that. But what's interesting, and in a way, you're just verging on there, the green agenda and how the hair shirt aspect of that, and how, look, we're facing this catastrophe. And I'm not saying we are. I'm just saying that's the narrative. We're facing this catastrophe. So, look, you've had it so good. We've all had it so good. But, now we're going to have to cut back. And the we here is not the we, is it? Your Blairs and people like that, your Bill Gates, they won't be cutting back. Okay. So really what they're preaching is, they're preaching water but drinking wine, albeit heavily disguised, but they're flying around to all the conferences and things like that. And there's a quasi-religious element to it as well, very much. Really, it's the idea of, look, industrialization has been a horror. I mean, it's so bizarre because you've got people preaching this whose everything they've got relies on industrialization, and the idea of a pre-industrial world is a nightmare. So anyway, but the kind of narrative that they like to preach is very much that and it's never them, but we must atone for this. So, people will be poorer, but you'll be happier. But what's missing from this, of course, is maybe we're tired of materialism. We're sick and tired of it. There's vast areas of the world which would say, give us more of it, please. We haven't had enough of this yet. And this is where there's this problem, and it links a bit to what we talked about before, where, for instance, China is still, although it's industrialized massively and something, they've still got a huge agrarian population that wants to move into the cities, let alone other parts of the world. And so, our position of, look, we've had everything and now we'll cut back because it's not globally shared at all, whatever they're claiming. It is not at all. and the rise of China in particular, but also these other places that are not swallowing this. And I'm not on their side here. I'm not taking sides. I'm simply saying our kind of ennui and our, we're sated with materialism and everything. Yeah, I mean, tell that to people in Africa who still have to burn, they haven't got electricity. So that's what's so fascinating here.
Yeah, people in Africa are maybe still burning dung.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not laughing at them. I'm just saying I wouldn't want to do that, but our ancestors probably did. Many people in the West for quite some time, not necessarily connected with the green agenda, often not actually, have been simplifying their lives and downsizing a bit. Many people during the pandemic period went through that kind of epiphany, thinking, actually, I don't really need all this stuff. So that trend's already in play, but that's fine if you're figuring that out and kind of choosing that for yourself and working out your own way to, shift your priorities. It's not the same for people who are weaned on materialism as all there is, materialism as a lifestyle and as a worldview, and then being told this stuff's going away. You might lose that house that you slaved day and night to get a mortgage on, and you might have to sell your car, and maybe you won't be able to take those foreign holidays. Those people are not mostly psychologically prepared to deal with that, and you can see that in our everyday politics. Every day, just, and the politicians running around trying to square the circle, trying to say, we must, go green, at the same time saying, help for struggling families, and it's kind of morbidly funny in a way, amusing to watch, just seeing them struggle to do this. I suppose you'd sum it up in recent headlines in this country, in the UK, was like, all motor vehicles new ones sold in this country must be fully electric by 2030. Now, that was revised, that was brought forward. Originally, it was 2040. Then they thought, let's get ambitious with the green thing, and they made it 2030. Just recently, it's like, 2035, which I predicted, what anybody with half a brain cell would have predicted. So there you see the tension. We've got to drive this climate agenda forward, but if we poke the wasp's nest too much, there's going to be trouble. That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalisefreedom.com.
legalisefreedom.com